think we'll get started. My name is Chris Coffey. I am the chairperson of the board of WIN, which is such a huge honor. And I'm moderating this discussion today. And I think we're going to have hopefully an informative and engaging session. I'm really excited to just dive right in. Just a couple of housekeeping things for all of our folks. Whether you're a longtime supporter of WIN or new to our community, we're so grateful that you're taking the time to be here today. I know we have a couple folks on our board who are also joining us, Hillary and Chris Sternheimen. I'll probably miss a couple, but I'll get back to them. So thank you for also joining. We appreciate you. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions or thoughts, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A feature. I would tell you where it is, but it's different depending on which device you're using. We'll set aside time at the end to address questions. And just want to point out the webinar is being recorded and the replay will be available for folks who missed it, or if you are so inclined to send it to anyone you think would be interested. Now I'd like to welcome and introduce our panelists for today's event. First, everyone knows, I bet every single one of the people who have already knows Christine Quinn, the great, the one and only. We're so lucky to have her as our president and CEO, especially in this super trying time. So big thank you. We also have Diana Santos, who's our Chief Program and Strategic Advocacy Officer. Really excited to have Diana. For those who haven't met her, she's a force. And Dr. Henry Love, last but certainly not least, is our Vice President of Policy and Planning and has been a whirlwind of success and inspiration since he's joined WIN a little over a year ago. You'll be able to hear from them personally and more in depth about the incredible work that they're doing. So let's go ahead and get started. I guess the first question is really for Chris. There are newer members that have not joined before. So I want to start off just by asking you a little bit about WIN and to tell us why are we talking about homelessness today?
So thank you, Chris, and thank you for being our board chair. I think being a board chair of a nonprofit is close to being the chair of a co-op board in thankless work. So let me take a second to thank you. WIN, which also sometimes is referred to as Women in Need, is the largest provider of shelter and permanent supported housing for homeless families with children in the city of New York. And supportive housing, as I said, is permanent, but it has services on site, a case manager, maybe a medical professional who can dispense medicine to folks. And it's really a very effective way for formerly homeless people to move into permanent housing and have it be really permanent and a lifetime placement. We believe about 30% of the homeless mothers need supportive housing to really thrive independently. We have soon to be 14 shelters at the end of November. We believe that our 14th shelter will open on Staten Island. They are really excited about it. Actually, they've come around and they're fine. And we have 5 congregate supportive housing buildings and 200 scattered site apartments that are permanent. In shelter, we really think of it as our job being breaking the cycle of homelessness in an intergenerational way. Because when that family moves out of shelter, we don't want mom and the children to come back, and we don't want the children to come back when they are adults. And that happens a great deal. In the city of New York, and you might have heard about this in the press lately, as a result of a consent decree 40 years ago, the city of New York is the only city in the country with the right to shelter, a requirement that people who are homeless get housed. Because of that, the city contracts that work out, the housing work, the shelter work, to not-for-profits like WIN. In that contract are some things we have to do. We see that contract as the floor. We see the needs of our clients as the ceiling. And I'll give you an example. The contract really talks about the adult in the family, not the children. But we know that being homeless for a child is a tremendous trauma, and that they need personalized services. So the difference between the floor and the ceiling is a holistic wraparound model based on trauma-informed care that we call the way to WIN. And it includes things like a camp for children, every school break, all summer, a STEAM-based camp for children that includes wonderful field trips like the Intrepid and the Children's Museum of Manhattan and the Aquarium in Brooklyn and many other places. It also includes, and these things are largely paid for by private donations that many of you make, so thank you for that. And if you haven't, you can go to our website and pick up the slack there. We also have what we call income building services, which is our job training and job placement service. Last year, income building services helped raise the average salary of our moms by $4. And about 30% of our moms come into WIN working, and it's close to 60% when they leave WIN are working. Now, these extra services are what helps families really stabilize when they get out of shelter. 91% of the families we placed out of shelter last year are still out of shelter a year later, which is very, very exciting. Also, last year, we were able to reduce the length of stay in shelter. And although I know WIN is the best shelter system there is for families, you don't want to be there a day longer than you have to. It's not a home. We reduced the length of stay from 15 months to 11 months. Now, the last thing I want to point out about WIN that is unique and distinct is that we have an advocacy department. We house over 12% of all the homeless families in New York City. So what we see, what those families share with us, and it's a real gift for somebody to share with you the story of their lowest moment. 80% of our moms are domestic violence survivors. To share that is very brave. And we have to honor that by taking that information and putting it into action right now, so we can get policies changed, so homeless families can get housing, which is the ultimate answer, and fewer families can come into shelter. That's what our advocacy department does. A few years ago, our advocacy department was able to get the amount of money in housing vouchers, what you use to rent apartments if you're formerly homeless, increased from $1,500 to $2,200. And that really changed how many people could rent apartment, largely why our length of time went down. More recently, we passed a law that requires that there be mental health services in all family shelters. You would have thought that was the case. You would have been wrong, but now that is the case. And right now, our advocacy department, Dr. Love and his colleagues, are leading the way in the fight to prevent Mayor Adams from repealing that 40-year consent decree and 40-year consent decree, and trying to get rid of the right to shelter. Now, I'll just say one thing super quick. In addition to our traditional work, if you will, we are working now with the many asylum seekers, refugees who have come to this country seeking freedom, seeking safety, seeking a way out of poverty, and we are working with them, working hand in glove with other advocates for the homeless to make sure that they have shelter and are safe, and that the immigration laws are helping them get settled now that they are here. So you'll hear more about that from Dr. Love, but I want to thank you all. It's easy. Oh God, is it easy, given all the tumult in the world right now and all that's going on in our city, to throw up your hands and say, forget about it. There's nothing good we can do here. But the truth is, WIN is a miraculous place where good is happening every single day. We had a homeless mom take a box, go into her shelter, pick out clothes, into her closet, pick out clothes she didn't need, go door to door, and then put that in the lobby with a note for the new arrivals. That's the kind of generosity and vision that comes out of WIN, and the kind of generosity and vision our clients give to us. So I want to thank you for joining this morning in support of WIN, but also in support of optimism and the belief that we can and will and must do better as a city. So thank you all, and thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. All so meaningful and moving. You touched on Dr. Love's work, so I think we want to hear more about that. I know many of us have been closely following the city's recent attempt to strip away some of the legal protections for the right to shelter, which is we're going to hear more about, but an Ed Koch era law. Henry, can you share more background about what's happening at the city, state, and federal level, and what is WIN doing about it? I know there's a lot, so thank you, Henry.
Yeah, there's a lot, and I hope I'm able to touch on most of it because it's a lot and it's changing by the day. But I'll just start at sort of at the 30,000 foot level, and the fact that what we are experiencing right now is the collision of two crises, the immigration crisis as well as the housing crisis. And so, over the past decade, both of these crises have just really exacerbated at a national scale, arguably globally, but nowhere arguably has it been felt more than in New York City. And so I'll kind of start with the immigration piece because I think, the housing piece, we live in New York. We've seen sort of how this housing phenomenon has happened over the years. It's no surprise to folks that the current rental rates in Manhattan are the highest that they've ever been in the city. The highest they've ever been. So yes, we are in an affordability crisis, but what's also happening is a global migration crisis. And so what we're seeing across the globe and over the past decade is really mass migration flows, in particular in the Western Hemisphere, at rates that we haven't really seen in sort of modern history. And so with these changes, and much of it is fueled by political instability, Venezuela, for example, violence, racial, ethnic discrimination that we see a lot coming from our families that are coming specifically from areas of the Northern Triangle, such as Honduras and Guatemala, El Salvador, but also related to economic and climate change. And I think a lot of times people don't think about these things as reasons as to why folks move. And a lot of these things are interconnected. And when we talk to our families and we understand what are the motivating factors for why they left their homes, it's often not one of these, it's often in multi-layered. And just one example of this, because I think the more we probe about this, and I'll get a little bit into this a little bit later about some of the work we've done with some of our legal clinics and work authorization work, is that when you talk to people why they came, there's almost like this script that I think that people have maybe picked up on the routes and whatnot, to say, they want to come here to work and they want a better life, right? And I think one of the interesting things that we found as we've talked with clients and worked closely with them is that yes, that is true, but that is like sort of a byproduct. And really at the root of why they left oftentimes is related to ethnic or racial discrimination or violence. And so, one woman in particular who was Ecuadorian, she was from a particular village and she couldn't work. And it had to do with her indigeneity and the way that community was being suppressed in Ecuador. And so, when she went to the capital city to try to get a job, she was told that she couldn't work there because of her indigeneity. And so that, caused her to move back and couldn't get any work, couldn't do anything. Eventually it got so bad that she was forced to flee. And so we hear many of these stories from folks from there. Also, we have a pretty big Garifuna population, which is a group of Afro-descendant Hondurans who live pretty much on the coastal areas who are sort of being impacted by, specifically racial discrimination, but also disproportionately impacted by climate change. And the violence that's happening there with gangs and working in consort with government officials to move them off of their land. So they're being displaced in Honduras and being forced to flee. And we're seeing that sort of manifestation in our shelters. So what I want to add to that is that these trends are not unprecedented. New York City has always welcomed immigrants. In fact, what we're seeing now in this current increase is not much different. Is actually less than what we saw at the turn of the century. But what is different is that we are in the midst of arguably the worst housing crisis in the city's history, which is now colliding with this. And so all the points that Chris raised in terms of how the city is grappling with this, we've tried a host of different options that Chris meant in terms of some of the city FEPS reforms to help try to create capacity. And unfortunately, that hasn't a lot of these things the administration hasn't looked to. And so one of the things that they've decided to move in this direction, which we kind of anticipated last year because of how they were sort of setting up these dual systems, was the repeal of the right to shelter. And sort of why we thought this might happen was last year we saw the beginnings of this, where there was sort of a setting up of this system under health and hospitals where these massive facilities were opening, and it became really unclear. And now this sort of been solidified. And so, New York is really unique in that we have a right to shelter. We're one of a handful of jurisdictions, Massachusetts, DC, and a lot of, at least in New York City, how it manifested is it came out of a series of lawsuits in the 1980s. The 1980s were really a really horrible time in the homelessness space in New York City, and we really moved towards trying to turn the tide on that and create a right to shelter. And so, over the past year, though, as a result of these intersecting crises, we've seen the shelter system more than double. So around this time last year, it was close to 50, 60,000. Now, as of today, we're close to 120,000 in the city's care, which is just insane. And I think people just could not have fathomed that a year ago. And so, as a response to that, the city is chipping away at elements that are critical to the right to shelter. And one of those areas that they're chipping away with is something called the 60-day rule. And in the 60-day rule, the way I would think about this is a host of it's part of the administration's, well, not even just the administration. I think it's a divergent strategy, if you will, and sort of a mechanism to try to slow down folks from coming, which we believe is not going to really have any, substantial benefit. But essentially, families will have 60 days. Migrant families, I will say, will have 60 days that they will be allowed to stay in the migrant facilities. They'll get a notification where they'll have to return to the intake center at the Roosevelt Hotel, and then might get placed into another hotel or whatever the case may be, or whatever the shelter is. But they're going to be sort of in this rotation. And that's really concerning to us, and especially in terms of schooling for kids, because pretty much every 60 days they'll be living in a new place. And so this is really concerning to us in terms of the stabilization of families that are already dealing with incredible amounts of trauma. And so, what we hope to do is hope that through this amazing coalition that Chris was able to pull together in, like, I don't know, was it like 48 hours, 24 hours? It was really impressive, with Bishop Hyde of St. John the Divine, to really get at protecting this really important piece of who we are as New Yorkers, the right to shelter, and forming the New York SANE Coalition, which is the New York Sheltering All in Need Equally Coalition, which is a compilation of religious community leaders from across the city. And we had a vigil yesterday. It was absolutely beautiful at St. John the Divine. Religious leaders from the Jewish traditions, Islamic traditions, Christian, religious denominations, and all different types of service providers, et cetera, all coming together to really protect the right to shelter and not erode it, to make sure families with children in need are provided with safe placements, and that all three levels of government are working together cooperatively, which has not been the case, that the influx of asylum seekers and other arrivals, New York requires a comprehensive decompression strategy. And the last piece is that we're demanding that a right to shelter is just the floor, and that the real answer to homelessness is housing. And so, Chris can, speak a lot to some of that work, but what I will sort of wrap up on is that, as we're pushing for that, we've kind of pivoted in the past couple of weeks to really focus our efforts on this, because I think we saw this coming, but we didn't anticipate it to happen as quickly as it did. I've been saying I thought this might happen over the course of a year or two, and all of this sort of happened within like a week. So it's been sort of whiplash for a lot of us on the policy side. But as this is happening, we've also continued to be pushing for work authorization for our undocumented as well as our asylum-seeking families. And we were really lucky to be able to work with some members of the New York delegation, members of the Department of Homeland Security, and the White House to really push for and get Venezuela TPS, which we were so excited for, because that's going to be a game changer for a lot of our families. But we're not done yet. And so we're still fighting to get that for Hondurans, Colombians, Ecuadorians, we're also fighting for voucher access for more folks. So Chris kind of mentioned some of the work we're doing with making City FEPS more accessible to folks. City FEPS voucher, which is the city's voucher, to more folks. So we, passed a group of package of bills a few months ago that we're sort of really pushing for the implementation to be done correctly. That will expand greater access to vouchers into the community, but we also really are fighting for getting voucher access to folks regardless of citizenship, because we really have to think of a host of different strategies to really decompress the situation. So I'll stop there because there's a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Love. I want to get to Anna Santos as well. Henry, and to some extent, Chris's role means being at City Hall a lot. Your role means spending a lot of time serving WIN's clients in the shelter system. So my question for you is, how does WIN support families that are currently living in our sites, and how is that different than the city before?
Hi, everyone. When we get assigned a family, we take care of our families in a different way than the rest of the shelters here in New York City. And what I mean by that is that we welcome our families with an interdisciplinary team that is constantly trained on trauma-informed care, amongst other things. And so when a family comes into WIN, what we do is welcome the family and have an assessment done immediately, starting the minute they walk into the building, in order to see what the need of the family is as quickly as possible. Our goal is to meet their needs and to try and assist them in transitioning back into society and stabilizing that family to the best of our ability. In order to do so, we have a team of experts that assess families from different perspectives. For example, we have a case manager, a program director, a social service supervisor, a mental health specialist, usually a social worker, a housing coordinator, an income building specialist, childcare, recreation. And during their first 48 hours, an assessment is completed, a biopsychosocial is completed. And what we see is, what are the needs of this family? How can we assist in helping and meeting the needs of these families to the best of our ability? In order to do so, we not only see and speak to the whole family, but we also try and see what the family will like to do, and them being the driver of their next steps in order to get to the goal of housing. Our biggest department that I would say works the hardest and is one of the hardest to sustain and maintain because it's through outside funding would be income building. Unlike any other shelter, we here fundraise to continue to have income building in all of our shelters. Income building does not only assess clients for future jobs, but assesses skill set and is able to bring in new people to teach new skill sets in order to heighten their availability for jobs and be able to really assess what the client wants to do and what careers they're looking to see. The investment in our clients and in our staff is so that we do not see families come back. What we want is to stabilize them to the best of our ability so that they can transition as successfully as possible back into society. We not only have these wraparound services, we also know that most of our families are single moms, and the assistance of childcare and recreation can really make a difference between how long they stay in a shelter. Unlike most shelters, here in-house, we have childcare and we have our recreation team, which assists moms in taking care of their child and making sure that they're safe and making sure that they have a learning environment and a growing environment. This too, as Chris mentioned, is also all year round. And we offer Camp WIN, which we mentioned briefly. Camp WIN is any time that children are not in school, they are with us either in childcare or recreation, and they attend millions of trips all over New York City. Not only trips for either educational purposes or what we call STEM purposes, but also through the arts and different, as you know, opportunities that New York City can have for our kids in order to see and widespread more of a lens of what's happening. This also is unique to WIN and is also funding from outside. DHS limits their funding and gives us very basic funding. And so in order to enhance our services during these times, we fundraise from outside for this childcare, for recreation in order to be able to satisfy trips and do other things with the children. I think it's the most different shelter that I've seen in 15 years that I've worked in shelter, meaning that the face of shelter has now changed. Usually, or in the first few years, what you saw were families that, or single adults that really struggled with no job, or that one person lost their job and they fell behind. Now we see families with jobs coming into shelter. New York City vouchers are so important to families, especially those that are not working or working, in order to be able to transition back into society because rents are so high. Henry touched on the amazing work that they've done in order to increase vouchers and to fight what we thought was just unfair. People were getting vouchers that were way beneath or below market rate. And now we match markets, giving us more opportunities to look at housing and different housing throughout New York City. And so we were able to increase these vouchers, and now people have so many more opportunities to be able to transition. Not only did we expand that, we were able to make it available quicker and to more people more than ever. And so while our population continues to change, and it's the most different I've seen since being in shelter, I think that what we've seen this past year with our migrant families has definitely been a shocker to all of us, whether we've been in shelter for 1 year or 15 years. Our families come in with something. Each one of our families comes in with either paperwork, some clothing, some winter clothing from having grown up in New York City, knowing that, as most of us, were bringing out our winter stuff starting probably past this Sunday, the 80-degree weather that we're having. And that's the typical New York family that we receive and try to support. These families came with the clothing on their backs and nothing of accessibility to any types of New York City support, such as food stamps or any other health insurance. These families came with no paperwork, no birth certificates, no report cards, nothing to say this is who I am and this is what I have. And so that level of support, I don't know we've ever seen in shelter. And both staff and who provide assistance for us, I don't think have seen us have to do the work from the bottom up in this way. Providing someone with everything from toothpaste to the fresh jacket to the fall weather clothing. And for children, I think it's the most children, I know it's the most children we've seen in shelter in this current time. Right now, we have about 260 families that came through the migrant families and about 700 children that are starting with nothing. And so for me, having been in shelter for 15 years, I think when people ask me what's the biggest difference you see, I think would be this cluster of families that we've received. So for us, being able to support these families, being able to provide these wraparound services has been an honor. And what we hope to do is to continue to be able to do so for each one of our families.
Thank you, Diana. We have some questions in the chat. We're going to get to them, but I did want to ask Chris about, we're reading a lot about the migrant situation. What is WIN doing? What are you doing about it?
So we were reading a lot about the migrant situation. One, because the mayor has gone to court, as we've said a couple times now, to try to repeal the right to shelter. And he's going into court to try to repeal it for singles. But make no mistake, it's a slippery slope. If they get that, they'll be back for families, no question about it. And unfortunately, Governor Hochul is supporting the mayor in this effort. Now, as Diana said, right, I don't envy the mayor. We couldn't have seen this coming. This wave of asylum seekers, of new arrivals, they were sent here beyond unceremoniously by the governor of Texas. No one could have seen it coming. But it now is the state of affairs in New York City. And we should all be pulling together to try to solve the problem. I said yesterday on New York One, I don't understand why the mayor has declared defeat when we haven't even finished the fight or really started the fight. So you will hear there's no more room. That's not true. It's just simply not true. On Tuesday night, there were 850 unfilled single shelter beds for single men and single women. If we were to take the housing vouchers, and I hope people understand that, we just keep saying it over and over, and make it available to the undocumented, we would be able to move the asylum seekers out of welfare hotels, which cost $383 a night, into permanent housing, which with the voucher costs $72 a night. Now, I could rattle off some more facts and horrible things the electeds are doing. But at the end of the day, we realized that when, like, yeah, of course, Chris Quinn and Wynn are upset about this. We wanted to send a message to the city and to the governor and the mayor that it wasn't just Wynn and the Coalition for the Homeless. It wasn't just those who work with the homeless. So we pulled together the same coalition, which includes religious leaders of all faiths, includes labor unions like 1199 and an array of others, to send the message that this is a concern to all New Yorkers. And this is a concern that everyday New Yorkers have, and they want people to be treated fairly. And we're going to be coming out in the next week or so with a multi-point plan, much of which you've heard this morning, of what we could do to actually take care of these New Yorkers. Instead, what the mayor is doing for families is saying, you're an asylum-seeking family, you can stay in shelter for 60 days. If you don't move out of shelter in 60 days, by the way, I mentioned our average length of stay is 11 months, and these folks have no access to vouchers. If you don't move out in 60 days, we're going to kick you out. You can go back to the intake center, the PATH center is what it's called, and reapply, and then we'll try to put you in another hotel or shelter. As you can imagine, that's just to harass people. You know what I mean? And this idea that they're going to know where to go and know how to go, it's just ridiculous. So we really would love all of you to go to the WIN website, go to the SANE website, sign up and be part of these efforts. Now, as it relates to internally in WIN, as Diana mentioned, we had to really change operations to some degree, right? Almost all of our clients qualified for food stamps, for example. We have pantries in every shelter, but they're like dry goods to hold you over the day or two until your food stamps kick in. But these folks had needed food for 3 meals a day, snacks, etc. We had to get all of that donated or pay for it. Last fiscal year, which ended in June, we spent $1 million more than we had been budgeted for on social services, just to give you an example. We always do a new coat drive, but not everybody always needs it. Every single one of the migrants needs a winter coat because they did not own one and did not come with one. So when, in addition to expanding those social services, in addition to getting more translators as volunteers, we also, under Henry's leadership, came together with the Fragaman Law Firm, which is the most premier law firm on immigration in the country, and have been doing legal clinics to help the new arrivals go through and determine what their legal options are, and you really only have a year to get them. And as far as we can tell, we're the only real entity in the city doing this. So that's something else we need to expand, particularly now that there is the TPS option for Venezuelans. So that's a somewhat of the picture, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the questions and answers.
Thanks, Chris. I want to go around the horn because I'll start with you, Chris, and then go to Henry and Diana. But we hear a lot about horror stories. I think we also want to hear a little more, like, there are things every day that I hear you all talk about that give us all hope. Can you, starting with Chris, Henry, and Diana, just like go around the horn? Like, what's something that gives you hope that happens in your course of work?
Well, I'll mention two things, if I may. The first is as it relates to staff. So we have 24-hour security at WIN, cameras in everywhere, but the private rooms. And our security staff saw and heard about a device that helps save the lives of people when they're choking. Funny enough, you can sometimes see it on an infomercial. Anyway, Dad comes running out of the room with his baby, who's 4 months old, who's choking. And they, using this device they had asked if we could get, they saved this baby's life. Now, that's not to outdo the staff who not long ago delivered a baby in the lobby of one of our shelters. Somebody said to me, "What kind of training do you do for that?" I said, "Training? No, we don't want to be delivering babies, but when you have to, you have to." And not to outdo the numbers of our staff who have done overdose savings with Narcan. And that really, to me, is just, people being unafraid, going in and doing what they have to do. Also, when the asylum seekers started showing up, and they were really basically Spanish speakers, our maintenance staff and our security staff, but really our maintenance staff, started staying after work to translate. They weren't telling anybody really they were doing this, so they weren't getting paid. Now, we found out about this and obviously fixed that, but that's amazing considering that they are not the highest paid folks out there. I mean, it's just a level of commitment. And then I just heard yesterday about a woman who had come to win. She was fleeing domestic violence. She took advantage of mental health services, just everything. She had a college degree, et cetera. And now she's a caseworker for WIN in a different shelter than the one she's at. So those are some of the things that should make people inspired about the power we all have to support each other and make sure that our worst moment isn't what defines us.
Henry Love, you're up next.
So thank you, Chris. I think mine are a bit more macro maybe, and less sort of WIN focused. But for me, it's this in New York sane for me really, and just like the fact that we were able to pull this together so quickly. And I think I was telling Chris this yesterday. At the visual was just. I was in a very hopeless place. The world is there's a lot happening, and a lot of, rawness and a lot of emotion. And to see, dozens of, maybe hundreds of folks on the steps of this church, Buddhists, Muslims, folks who are Jewish, Christian, different Christian denominations, organizers, people who are actually asylum seekers, like everyone together, people walking down the street, that gave me hope. That, as we were sitting here talking, as we were doing the visual, people were walking down Amsterdam Avenue and just like stopping and like listening and smiling. And it was like, I don't know if I even mentioned this to you, Chris. I actually saw someone I went to college with who saw it, and he like stopped and was like, huh, and stayed for the whole thing, and like brought other people. And it was like a group of folks like sort of convening. And it was like, wow, like people do care. And, although it seems like we're fighting a group of folks that seem heartless or whatever, people do care. And I think so that, and, the other thing that really gave me hope is, and I told Chris, I got a call maybe a couple of weeks ago from a county administrator in upstate New York, in a county that is very much a Trump county and all this, and was like, look, we don't care about politics. We want to help people. How can we help with some of the families that are dealing with what's going on in New York? Because we want to, and we know that it's not, the political best thing to do, but people need help. So that, and then I think also, the work we did with City FEPS and the expansion of that, and working closely with the City Council. I mean, you were working with them hand in glove, and it was just an incredible process. And I think it was sort of, I think for many of us, we have a lot of angst towards the way government operates and electeds. And I thought it was just beautiful the way the speaker, the deputy speaker, the different sponsors leaned into experts and folks with lived experience to say, hey, we're not the experts. This is not our thing. We're legislators, but we want to lean in on you all to figure out what's best and listen to you and then craft that. And so to be a part of that, to me, was really hopeful as well.
Thank you, Henry. We're going to bounce around a little bit because there's so many questions. So we'll come back to Diane in a minute. What is the percentage rate for recidivism for WIN families? I don't know if that's Chris or Diana. Chris, you 9%.
And that, which is look, I want it to be 0. And Henry and Diana are like, yeah, she's that crazy. But that's really amazing that 91% don't return. And that's much. And now the next question is going to be, how does that compare to the city? But the city does their numbers. I won't go into the whole thing in a totally bullshit way. It's not just this administration, they always have. So you don't really have an apples to apples.
Laura Galt wants to know if WIN wants to work with migrant families who don't live in your shelters. And can we refer migrant families to WIN?
That's a complicated question, given how our city contracts work, though we don't have contracts for the migrants, but even how it relates to having community members come into the shelter. So whoever asked that question, maybe Henry, reach out. We can have a conversation. I don't know. We might have to do it, say, like with New York Immigration Coalition at New York Immigration Coalition. It's just complicated, but we'd love to discuss it further.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, Chris, too, the other thing I would add, as a result of what we just talked about with the 60-day rule and some of what the mayor is proposing, migrant families are not coming into tier 2 shelters, which are the shelters that WIN provides, and they're being segregated into a separate system that's primarily run by health and hospitals.
Right, so we do have to have this conversation. That's a good point, Henry, so we'd love to have it with you.
Are mental health services mandated or optional for families at WIN?
So as a result of Local Law 35, in about a year's time, they will be mandated that all of the family shelters get funding for on-site, which might be telehealth, but for on-site mental health services. But for the clients, you don't have to go. We can't and wouldn't require anybody to go, but we know if it's on-site, there'll be a very high participation rate. And when we've done referrals, we did a referral a few months ago, and the person was, really struggling. They were challenged. And it was 3.5 months for intake. So this is really going to be a game changer, but you can't require anything. It wouldn't work, but you're not allowed anyway.
I've seen we have three other board members who I see are on, so big thank you to them: Dr. Linda Tewksbury, Pam Parker, and Jasmine Carr. Thank you, in addition to Hillary and Kristen, former board chair. So thank you all for being. That's great. When is the WIN shelter due to open on Staten Island, and will families have to go through PATH in order to secure a placement in WIN? We have a very educated.
I know.
Group of, these are serious questions from very serious folks.
I'm glad I didn't go to school with any of these folks, because they're smart and informed. They would have screwed up the curve big time. It should open by the end of November or by mid-November. We were having in classic governmental style, the Department of City Planning changed the address, which threw Department of Buildings into a tizzy, but we seem to have fixed that since 2 of my council colleagues are commissioners of both of those agencies. So the end of the month, every homeless family that seeks shelter has to go to the intake. There's only one intake in the Bronx. It's called PATH, Prevention something, something, something. So yeah, but the shelter in Staten Island is going, as the one in Coney Island does, prioritize families on Staten Island for the shelter. And if there are Staten Island families in other shelters, once our shelter, which we're calling the Audre Lorde shelter, once that opens, and say you're in a shelter in the Bronx, but you're from Staten Island, you can transfer to Audre Lorde.
Thank you. And I want to make sure I'm not asking questions that Henry's already answered. But thank you so much. The wraparound service sounds amazing. My experience has been moms in shelter will receive a voucher for childcare, and once they start working, the voucher is taken away due to making too much money, so the parent is back to square one. Does your child care services depend on income? Henry, I think you took a shot at this. Do you want to elaborate?
I'm sorry, I was going with Diana.
Let me just jump in here. I'll throw it to Diana. child care services at Wynn are only for the clients at that shelter. Or sometimes maybe we'll have one center for two small shelters, but we don't take the public. So it doesn't matter whether you're working, whether you're not working. But Diana, can you talk a little bit about when people leave, what happens? Because this is one of the biggest issues why people can't keep a job.
Right. The goal to our childcare is to be able to provide childcare for families coming in. Eventually, what we want is to help them transition into a more stable childcare outside of Wynn. And so while they're here, we help apply for the voucher, and the voucher then applies for outside childcare. As Chris mentioned, this is not a seamless process and doesn't always work. And for whoever asked the question, you're absolutely right. Sometimes if the person is making too much money, they don't qualify for the voucher and the voucher is taken away. However, they do start the process while being here, and we do assist them in transitioning wherever they're going to live with the new childcare and the new childcare voucher.
Diana, tell us what's too much money about.
Well, the poverty level here in New York, depending on that and depending on the size of the family, depends on what they are making, which then considers them for a voucher. And so depending on the size of family, depending on their salary, depending on how many people go under the voucher is how the voucher is decided on. And
but it's not a lot.
It's very low, right?
Super interesting. What percentage of the clients receive child support and pass-through payments? Who wants to take that?
I don't know.
Not Henry.
We can find out.
4 for 4. We're going to get back to you.
Yeah. That's a great question. Great question.
Yeah, that is a good question. This is like a super informed group. I love it. Dr. Linda Tewksbury, one of our newest and greatest board members, thank you for this presentation and important work. Given the difficulty finding housing in New York, even with vouchers, from what I've heard, have you had any success helping families find housing work outside of New York?
Well, let me just say one thing. It is hard to find an apartment in New York. That is true. That said, when Wynn advocated successfully at the end of the de Blasio administration to raise the voucher from $1,500 to $2,200, it opened up about 36 neighborhoods where the area median rent matched the amount of the voucher. And although it is hard, we are citywide, month after month, seeing the number of vouchers that are getting used go up. I only mention that because it's true, but it's not like defining of the problem, and we don't want to get too sucked into that narrative as the only issue. Dr. Tewksbury is right that the mayor, and I give him a lot of credit for this, and it's important, as we say at Wynn, to call balls and strikes, and that was definitely a strike on his part. He did a good job of saying these vouchers can be used statewide. Diana, how successful have we been with that, or with getting outside of the 5 boroughs?
We just got permission to be able to use the vouchers outside of New York. Not a lot of people want to leave because their support systems are in New York. However, those that did want or do want or are open to the idea have gone, and we've had some families move out.
I would just add to that, Diana, one of the things that we've sort of begun doing is having conversations with different communities upstate and beginning to plant those seeds about, hey, we have folks that might be interested in that? Are there any landlords in your community that would be interested in this? And I think there's a lot of, just call it what it is. There's a lot of concern and prejudice about lower income people of color moving into certain communities upstate. And so, one of the things that we're trying to work with is how do we find allies and partners that, want to push through that narrative.
And 2 counties that have been really great on this, but also on the migrants, Cortland County, that's the Trump county, and also Albany. The mayor of Albany who I have long thought was a rock star. She's also a natural redhead Irish gal who made it to mayor, but that's a whole nother conversation for another day. She's been dynamite, really dynamite on both of these things.
This might be our last question. It's from Diana Rosenthal. Thank you for the session. Incredible work you do. I do research with families experiencing homelessness, so I know the new law requiring mental health professionals in families with children's shelters is a major step. However, concerns have already been raised regarding staffing, privacy issues, and poor Wi-Fi for telehealth. How are WIN and other shelters going to monitor its implementation? Are any particular mental health services being tailored to children during their development years? I'm not sure who wants to take this.
Wow.
Everyone's
Sure.
nodding.
Let me take parts of it, and then Diana, what I don't cover, you'll pick up. So we're actually having a meeting later today with the Department of Homeless Services Commissioner about implementation of Local Law 35 with the prime sponsor, Councilmember Eric Botcher. And this is not the first we've had with her. It's probably the third. So we're very much on the monitoring of implementation, which will include setting up a monitoring process once it starts. The Wi-Fi situation at shelters has gotten much better, really because of the pandemic, because the children couldn't learn, but that's part of this is an assessment, because they couldn't get access learning at school, etc. So that is much better, but we're obviously going to look at that. One of the requirements of the law around telehealth is private spaces for telehealth. So that's really, really prescribed. So far from Commissioner Park, I've seen a real willingness to do this right and to do it by the letter of the law, but we will continue to monitor and see starting this afternoon. Diana?
I think the last part of the question about it being focused around children or availability for children, that's exactly why we want to bring it to shelter. Our staffing now with clinical backgrounds are not able to practice in shelter and are not able to assess to the point that we would like them to with the children. And so this will give us an opportunity to bring in experts that can have one-on-ones with children and engage with them and be able to transition them outside for support. So yes, we'll be working with children.
I also see that Chris just mentioned Commissioner Park. Commissioner Jenkins, Commissioner Park's predecessor, is on. So big thank you, Commissioner Jenkins.
I owe you a call back. I know, Gary, I got to call you. You're on my call list. Sorry.
I'm going to throw it over to Chris for a second. I just do want to say, folks have asked sort of offline and around how you can help. We need resources to do this. We have an active board. We have an active group of partners. We have active corporate sponsors. We have volunteers. We have sort of all of the above that have really pitched in at this tough time to help us get to the next level. Chris and the development team and everyone at WIN is getting to the next level all the time, but it takes a tremendous amount of work and effort. So we really do need resources as well as other things that Chris can touch on. If you feel so inclined, go to www.winnyc.org or give me a call, give Chris a call, give the fundraising team a call. I'm always happy to meet folks. Everyone knows Chris Quinn will drop everything to help raise money for this organization, as will so many others. So, Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. I want to again thank everybody, the board members, former Commissioner Jenkins, everyone who's on this call. I want to thank Henry and Diana for being on the webinar and also for all of their amazing work. And I really, I'm not above begging, but I'm not going to beg. But I just want to say, most of the significant things you've heard and the real success of only 9% returning to shelter is a result of the extra services that we provide. And right now, we're adding extra and then extra for the migrants and then extra for the advocacy to preserve the right to shelter. So we need you to donate. And we're in October, but we're coming up close, right, on your end of year where you're going to make your decisions about what you're going to spend your money on. And I would implore you to spend it on WIN. Why? What could be a more important cause than helping children get out of shelter and while they're in shelter, deal with the traumas of domestic violence or sexual violence or just the trauma of being in shelter? You can literally change someone's life, change their future path by making sure we have trauma-informed care for those children and income-building services for their moms so they can work. So when you're thinking of who to give $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 to, think of WIN because of the cause, think of WIN because of the children, and think of WIN because we are a damn good investment with only 9% returning to shelter. Your money will not go to waste. And we probably know your address. And as my late grandmother would have said, if you don't give after having been on this, people will talk. But I know you are going to give. So thank you very, very much.
Huge thank you to everyone who's joined, to Chris, Henry, Diana, to Georgia and Jessica, and all the folks that helped behind the scenes to put together. The link is in the chat if you want to donate. If you don't, you can go to the website. There's lots of different ways. We really do value you. And we also promise to get everyone out on time. It's now 10 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.